Hello, everyone. Great to be live with you. We are zoning into the Oath Keepers trial related to January 6th. We're in week 2 now of this very important federal trial, probably the most important trial in the nation right now. In that federal courtroom, cameras aren't allowed. We wish they were, so we could shed light on what is happening to these guys who've been locked in solitary confinement this whole time. But also in that courtroom, there's no Fox News, Newsmax, Blaze TV, none of the so-called right-wing media in there. All of the leftist media is allowed in that courtroom. So we got the New York Times, Politico, and the big networks like that, CNN's in there. So they're covering it, but are they covering it fairly and accurately? Well, there happens to be a lone independent journalist in that federal courtroom who is filling in the blanks. Turns out the corporate media, once again, is lying through omission. Key takeaways from this trial are simply they're pretending like they're not happening. So I'm going to bring on Steve Baker, the Pragmatic Constitutionalist, to fill in the blanks on what is happening to these 5 members of the Oath Keepers in their trial today. Before we jump into it, shout out to the sponsor of my coverage. We all know that violent crime has jumped a lot since the start of the pandemic. Now, attackers' worst enemy is attention. This is why I highly recommend the Scream Siren. Scream Siren is the ultimate personal protection alarm. They require no training or skills to operate and can be used by anyone regardless of age or physical ability. The fact of the matter is victims are often too traumatized to shout or fight back in a dangerous situation. Criminals hate attention will likely run off after realizing this alarm won't stop. Nearly 100,000 users trust the Scream Siren with their life. Try the Scream Siren risk-free for 90 days and for up to 50% off by clicking the link in the description box down below. That is screamsiren.com. After placing your order, Scream Siren will be delivered straight to your doorstep. Let me show you what it looks like real quick. You can put that right on your keychain. Hit that Scream Siren if you need to. It's only about less than $15 actually. All right, with that being said, let me bring on Steve Baker, Pragmatic Constitutionalist, covering the Oath Keepers trial. Steve, thanks so much for joining me again.
Thanks, Ivory. Good to be back with you.
So you're right there outside of the federal courthouse.
Yes, I am.
Trial just released for the day. And I'm reading in Reuters that it was the main focus was testimony of an FBI agent today. Is that right?
That's correct. FBI Special Agent Eller was on all day today.
Eller. Okay. I'm reading in Reuters that Special Agent Brian Cody was supposed to testify today. Did that not happen?
I think that he started the morning. He was just being, he had needed to finish up some of his redirect from the previous hearing, which was on Friday morning. So that was finished up, and then Eller took over.
So Reuters calling them the anti-government Oath Keepers group, four members and the leader being tried today. So Steve, tell me about what are the main factors that the mainstream media is pretending don't exist in this trial?
The bottom line, Ivory, is they're doing exactly what we would expect them to do. They're going to, because as you mentioned before, there's no cameras in the courtroom in a federal courthouse. So they have all of the leverage and the latitude that they need to shape the narrative without any contrary perspective. And it's amazing. I'm sitting in the media room with 25 other mainstream media journalists, and myself and maybe one other independent journalist is even in the room. And I'm certainly the only one that's looking at this through a different lens than what the mainstream media journalists are portraying this. But the bottom line, as I said, is that they're only going to give us the narrative, the nuggets that are coming out of the trial that feed the American people what the powers that be, what the Department of Justice, what the January 6th committee, what Nancy Pelosi wants to be seen. That's it.
Wow. You mentioned last week there was one man, I guess he was a former Oath Keeper, who testified on the leader's desire for violence. And most of the mainstream media omitted him completely, pretended he didn't exist.
Yes, there was a reason why, actually several reasons why they pretended he didn't exist. First of all, the gentleman, if I can call him that, was easily one of the weirdest human beings I've ever encountered in my life. I mean, we're talking about a strange bird. He has had a minimum of 6 different legal names since 2007. And then he volunteered without even being asked. That's not counting the 30 or 40 other names I use online in my online persona. He claims to be a former Oath Keeper. He actually claims to be a former Oath Keeper leader, but in order for him to actually have become an Oath Keeper, he would have had to lie on their application because the Oath Keepers do not permit convicted felons in the Oath Keepers. And this guy is not just a convicted felon, he is a convicted child molester.
Wow. So,
Yes.
I mean, how did he? I mean, he had a recording of them, though, but how did he get that? That's the main thing.
He was on one of the early conference calls. Now, this was a conference call, an organizational planning meeting that was taking place long before the actual January 6th rally was even announced by President Trump. Trump didn't announce that till December 16th, or December 19th, I believe it was. And so these were early recordings that are being presented by the prosecution. And let's just be perfectly honest. I wouldn't go so far as to call them anti-government rhetoric, but it's certainly anti this government in the way it's being run today rhetoric. These were tapes that were made after the election. These are people that believe that Biden stole the election, or that the election was at least stolen from Trump by whatever means or methods were possible. And then also they believe that the Biden administration, when it came in, would be a manipulated organism of the Communist Chinese Party. So there's all that kind of rhetoric that's taking place. And then in addition to that rhetoric, they're talking about, hey, are we at that point where we're going to have to rise up, where we're going to have to do a whole 1776 on these people? Are we going to have to, mount a revolution? So the prosecution is looking for the most inflammatory rhetoric that they can find to present to the jurors. And this guy had actually secretly taped one of these conference calls. So the reason why the prosecution had to bring him into the courtroom is because he has to authenticate the recording. They can't use the recording if the person who made it didn't authenticate it. But I can tell you this right now, Ivory, this guy, had the cameras been in the courtroom, there is no way that the prosecution would have risked putting him on the stand in front of those cameras, because this guy was duplicitous in every answer that he gave. He contradicted himself. He was antagonistic with the judge. He was antagonistic with the prosecution attorneys. He was antagonistic, obviously, with the defense attorneys. And he was just, as I said, he was just a bizarre human. I wrote an article about it. I called it the freak show, that they put a freak show on stage, because that's exactly what it was. And everybody knew it. Everybody in that courtroom was like, oh my gosh, what in the world have these guys done? And how are they getting by with this? Well, they're getting by with it because the camera's not there. But then, more importantly, in the media room, this is what happened. So when I finish my coverage every day, and I'm tweet storming on my Twitter account during the trial. So I did over 100 tweets today, documenting events and highlights of what's going on in the courtroom. But then at the end of the day, I get back to my Airbnb here in DC, and then I start pulling up all the mainstream media articles from all those journalists that are sitting in the room with me, and I start reviewing their stories. Well, on that day, last Thursday, when the freak show was in the courtroom, I started reading CBS, CNN, ABC, Reuters, AP, Huffington Post. I started reading all of their stories, and guess what they were doing? They didn't even mention that this guy was on the stand. They didn't try to whitewash him. He didn't exist. His testimony didn't exist. And by the way, the defense attorneys had a field day with him. They were able to shred him apart pretty well in front of the jury. The jury definitely did not look at this as a credible witness in any way, shape, or form. But what ended up happening is I was reading down through the other stories. I finally got to the New York Times, and we're talking about one of the most respected journalists in America. He's sitting in the room in there. Alan Fuhrer is his name. And he is the guy that actually wrote the Ray Epps apologetic story. Do you remember that a few weeks ago? The guy that came out and wrote and basically defended Ray Epps and said it's a nothing burger and let him alone, that sort of thing, portrayed him to be a really, nice guy that just got caught up in a bad deal, made a couple bad decisions. Well, this guy, this writer, in his story, he actually mentioned that this gentleman by the name of Abdullah Rashid, by the way.
Yeah, you have the article.
Yeah, so he actually mentioned that this particular gentleman had taped the conference call with the Oath Keepers, and then he cleaned up the testimony. He cleaned up the presentation in the New York Times article for the New York Times readers in such a way that he portrayed this guy as an actual credible witness, which he was.
Okay, here's the article you're referencing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Witness in Oath Keeper sedition trial says leader promoted violent approach. So New York Times is one of the very few who actually mentioned this duplicitous witness, that he even existed. Now, you told me you actually got to have lunch with this New York Times writer. Did you ask
the very
him,
next day?
Did you ask him why he whitewashed the story?
No, I didn't. But we got myself and a couple of other people. We got on him about the Ray Epps story, but we didn't get to that. And I didn't really want to bring it up because I had just blasted his version the night before on my own blog, so I really didn't want to go there with him at a friendly lunch. And so I didn't get into him with that. We did get on him about the Ray Epps story, as I said. But then the most important thing to notice about his story, besides the fact that he whitewashed it and made this Abdullah Rashid to be a credible witness, is that he completely, totally left out one of the most salient points, is that this guy is a convicted child molester. The only mainstream article that I could find was by Politico, and Politico played it straight. They actually showed him as a contentious witness, and that they told his entire story, and they actually shared the information about his felony conviction. And so, hat tip to Politico. They got it right.
And the reason him being a child molester matters in this case is because Oath Keepers never would have let them into their fold, right?
That's right. That's correct. He had to lie in order to be on that phone call with the Oath Keepers.
Okay, this journalist, New York Times, Alan Fuhrer, that sounds like Führer guy is Hitler, but that name would suck to have. Did you ask him about what did he say about his Ray Epps coverage? Why, by the way, why isn't Ray Epps there being charged with sedition?
Well, that would be, that certainly is the overriding question, isn't it? It seems to be on everybody's lips. Who is Ray Epps and why isn't he here as well? But Alan Fuhrer is a very smart, very articulate, very experienced writer for the Times. He's been with the Times for over 20 years, and he is their main legal correspondent. And of course, he's handling all of the January 6th related stories as well from a legal perspective. So he knows the courtroom, and he knows the lingo, and he knows the language, and he knows exactly how to present these things. But he is, the only way we can say it is he's one of the palace guards. That's what he is. He is actually there to shape the narrative that is preferred and is desired to be presented to the American public, and that's his job.
All right, so a big part of this Oath Keepers trial, they're on trial for seditious conspiracy, in that they were staged and ready supposedly to overthrow the government if they didn't get their president, Donald Trump. Now, they didn't get their president, Donald Trump. They didn't overthrow the government. Weapons weren't even at the Capitol. So, but the big thing the media is talking about here is this quick reaction force set up in Virginia. So the Oath Keepers allegedly had a stockpile of weapons at a hotel in Virginia close to D.C. where they could deploy those weapons, as one media outlet said, if things went wrong. Well, as far as I can see, things went wrong. They still didn't deploy the weapons. So what are they being charged with?
Well, this is what the defense has been very successful at presenting so far to the jury, is that, first of all, these quick reaction force, this notion, or the QRF, we'll use the letters for short here, is that the Oath Keepers, as their normal operational procedure, is they have a QRF at every single rally, every single event in which they provide security for VIPs or for rally attendees or whatever they've been brought in to do, because that's what they do, is they provide security, and they do it for VIPs of various types, as well as helping and assisting rally attendees from being attacked by, as you know, counter protesters such as Antifa. And that's a big part of this story, is the fact that they are successfully, when I say they, the defense is getting the actual FBI agents that are on the stand to admit that, first of all, yeah, that's the operational procedure of the Oath Keepers, is to have a QRF across, somewhere close, so that in case things do go bad. But in this particular case, even though things went bad, it didn't go bad in the way that they anticipated. They were worried that Antifa would be the ones that would start attacking rally attendees, or, and this is the other part of the story, which we probably don't have time to get into now, a big part of their defense is the fact that Stuart Rhodes, the founder of the Oath Keepers, was not going to activate the Oath Keepers or their QRF into any sort of violence or any sort of armed or aggressive conflict unless President Trump invoked the Insurrection Act and then called them in to assist in that. Neither one of those things happened. The Insurrection Act was not called and invoked by President Trump. Antifa, well, we know that they were there that day, but they were not operating in the way that they typically do. And as a result of that, Stuart Rhodes did not call in the QRF, and those guns were legally stored at a hotel in Virginia and never brought into the District of Columbia.
So it's not illegal to have a stockpile of weapons. It's also not illegal to have a well-regulated militia.
No,
fact,
it's not.
And not only is that not illegal, it's very much protected by the Second Amendment of the United States.
You would think so if you read that document. And of course, the Oath Keepers do not actually consider themselves a militia. They consider themselves, by their foundation and by their, their code of conduct and all of that, they are former and current law enforcement officers, military, retired and otherwise, and active duty. And these are people that wanted to extend their commitment to the country and to the oath that they took to defend the nation against all enemies, foreign and domestic. We're in that oath, and that's why they exist. And here's the most interesting thing, Ivory, of all, is that there were, on the January 6th, 35,000 registered Oath Keepers nationwide. And
at the Capitol?
No, nationwide. But
okay.
the FBI has been forced to admit on the stand that they are aware of no more than 12 to 15 actually in the Capitol area on January 6th. 12 to 15. So somehow, 12 to 15 unarmed men and women, a couple of them geriatrics who could barely get around, were going to conspire that day to overthrow our democracy and prevent the certification of the November 2020 election.
Incredible. Okay.
That's their argument. We have to believe that.
Well, you talked about Oath Keepers being like, well, we're just going to defend against Antifa. But let's face it, a lot of the Oath Keepers members were talking about more than Antifa. Okay. They were talking about, you in your podcast, you mentioned the Oath Keepers leader, Stuart Rhodes, mentioning how Abraham Lincoln acted as president. Donald Trump needs to act, how Abraham Lincoln was in the Civil War. These people, much of their rhetoric was in regards more to Civil War, was it not?
It was, but they were not going to act apart from their president, President Donald Trump, invoking the Insurrection Act. That was clear. That was what Stuart Rhodes wanted. He's made many speeches about it. He wrote 2 open letters to President Trump in the weeks following the election loss to encourage Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act. He even tried to contact him directly on several occasions, from what we understand. was not ever successfully able to do so. But he did not get what he wanted. President Trump did not invoke the Insurrection Act, and the Oath Keepers therefore did not bring any weapons or commit any violence that day.
So it's also not illegal to advocate, to campaign, to push a politician to do certain things. To ask a president to invoke Insurrection Act is also not illegal. So
I see absolutely no illegality in that whatsoever.
And all of their spoken words, I mean, their spoken words were, and their written words, a lot of what these guys are being accused of is in regards to their Facebook messages, things they posted on Facebook. And although, so this New York Times article, okay, so here's the first defendant, Stuart Rhodes, the leader. Then we have the second defendant, Kelly Meggs. And New York Times mentions here how the leader of Oath Keepers he was talking about calls for a bloody war against the Biden administration, quote unquote bloody war. I mean, these guys had definitely had inflammatory rhetoric, and apparently this is testimony from Michael Adams, who was the previous chief of the Oath Keepers chapter in the Tampa, Florida area. He resigned, he said, due to these inflammatory comments that he didn't like. He didn't want to be a part of a group that was calling for bloody war.
Correct.
Right?
And there was a lot of disarray. There was a lot of disorganization within the Oath Keepers because various groups, for instance, like the North Carolina Oath Keepers, where I live in North Carolina, they had just in the weeks prior to January 6th disassociated themselves completely from the national organization. And they were having similar problems around the country. And that was directly related to Stuart Rhodes' own rhetoric and his calling for the Insurrection Act so that they could move violently against the government. But again, it didn't happen, but they didn't like the rhetoric. And that is actually one of the defense strategies right now, is to show how in absolute disarray the Oath Keepers were by January 6th and the absolute impossibility for them to mount a conspiracy of insurrection at the time. Just weren't capable of doing it.
Okay, so real quick, I just want to make clear who's being tried today. So again, it's Stuart Rhodes, the leader. Kelly Meggs, he's a Oath Keepers member from Florida. We've got Kenneth Harrelson. New York Times didn't even show his picture, but this is the primary guy you're covering, Steve. He's also from Florida. And the New York Times pretty much says here that he didn't really have a lot to do with it. I mean, he didn't even have social media when these guys were conspiring on Facebook and things. And then Jessica Watkins, Army veteran from Ohio.
Right.
And the final one is Thomas Caldwell, who I guess he was an official member, but he was an Oath Keepers associate.
Yes, he was never an official dues-paying member, but he was associated and he did help them out. He has a large farm in Virginia, and he allowed them to do their it's kind of a operational gathering site for the various rallies that they would work at and that they would attend. So the Oath Keepers would meet there on his farm.
Okay, so what's next for the trial, and what should the average American pay attention to?
Well, they probably should pay attention to my tweet storm and my blog, because they're not getting much of the truth anywhere else. And here's the thing, and I have to really clarify this. If we're talking about, because I sat for several days next to the journalist from CBS, I've read his articles, and everything he says is accurate. Everything he says is true. The problem is that he's only portraying about half of what's taking place in the courtroom. So everything.
And you were mentioning it's primarily the prosecution side.
That's correct.
So when the defense,
obviously, yes.
Defense cross-examines and tears apart the narrative of the witness, the mainstream media ignores that.
Yeah, and I will tell you that this is not a slam dunk right now for the Department of Justice unless they own the jury by some means, and that's a conspiracy theory. It's not too far out of the realm of possibility in this town, because here in this town, federal trials that go before a jury in this town, they win 99% of them in this town. It's just the way it works. And that's because it's a highly skewed jury pool. Wow. But the defense has been incredibly successful thus far in getting these FBI agents to admit that, okay, you've done all this presentation, you've talked about all this inflammatory rhetoric. What have they done illegal? Nothing.
But their words were not peaceful.
Yeah. No, their words were not peaceful, but ultimately they're going to show them. They showed some of them inside the Capitol for the first time today, actual videos inside the Capitol. And as we know, that was a restricted space. And so
they did trespass.
If you want to convict them for a glorified trespassing charge, then great. But this seditious conspiracy thing is laughable on its face.
Wow. Okay, so checking the viewer comments real quick before we wrap up. Does this trial look like it will lead to anything bigger? What's your take?
Well, unfortunately there's going to be another Oath Keepers trial immediately following this. They just didn't have a courtroom side here at the Perryman Courthouse, which is right behind me. It's a very large structure. It's huge and it's got a big annex on it, but the actual individual courtroom sizes are not large enough to handle 10 defendants at a time, plus all of their legal teams. And so as a result, they've split that into two. There's going to be some other trials related to this as well. I think they've already now charged a couple of the Proud Boys with seditious conspiracy. They've actually charged the House in-house counsel of the Oath Keepers with conspiracy. So there's going to be some more trials related to this, and this is going to drag on for a long time. And then, of course, there are people that did bad things. Let's be honest about that. There were bad people that did bad things that day. There were good people that got caught up in the moment and did bad things that day, and they're going to pay the price for that. And most of them are going to be here in this courthouse, or they're going to be convicted by Zoom hearings, or however their individual judge wants to do that. But
like what sort of bad thing? What sort of bad things? Punching a cop?
Well, yeah. I mean, there were some people that brought weapons of not firearms, but that brought blunt force objects, and that had a little flag on an axe handle. Well, you don't show up at a protest rally with an axe handle unless you intend on doing something wrong with it. So the point being is that there were some people that did attack police officers. By the Department of Justice estimate, some 225 people that actually did violence that day. And then, of course, there's all the other types of charges: parading, the glorified trespassing charge, disrupting Congress. There were people that did property damage, obviously, that broke windows out, kicked doors in, went into Nancy Pelosi's office and spilled over desks and tables. So there was nefarious activities that took place, and people will genuinely pay the price for their bad deeds. But there are also, unfortunately, hundreds and hundreds of people that are paying the price for doing nothing more than seeing an open door and walking through it. And in some cases, a cop standing there either standing on the side of the door or welcoming them in. And that's, everybody's story is different.
I do have video of a cop waving people in.
Yeah, it happened. Happened more than once and in more than one location.
That's on my Rumble, y'all. It's not allowed on here on YouTube. Go follow my Rumble. Exactly. All right. Thank you so much for Steve Baker for coming on, and we will stay tuned. What is this going to be? Another 6 weeks or something of trial?
They're expecting this trial to take 6 to 8 weeks. We are in day 5 right now, and I would encourage everybody to go to my Twitter account. It's at TPC4USA, at TPC4USA, and then my longer synopsis every night, which I do both by video and written, is on my locals page, which is the Pragmatic Constitutionalist.locals.com. And
perfect. Yeah. So that's there. I've got Steve's Twitter on the screen, and then his locals and his Rumble is linked down in my description, guys.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. We'll talk to you later, Steve. Have a good one.
Thank you. All right.
Thanks everyone for tuning in. Go share this video. All right. Bye.